Imagine a time long, long ago, so long ago, in fact, that England wasn't even an island. It was connected to the rest of Europe by a stretch of land. This was the world our earliest ancestors discovered. Over 800,000 years ago, the first humans walked across this land bridge, following herds of giant animals like mammoths and woolly rhinos. They were hunter-gatherers. Their lives were a constant journey, moving from place to find food and shelter. They didn't have houses or farms. They lived in temporary camps, perhaps in caves or simple shelters made from branches and animal skins. Life was tough, and survival depended on working together as a small group. As thousands of years passed, the world changed dramatically. Great sheets of ice, called glaciers, advanced and retreated across the land. These ice ages made Britain incredibly cold and difficult to live in, forcing people to leave and then return when the climate warmed up again. Each time they came back, they brought new skills and ideas with them. They learned to make better tools from flint, a type of hard stone. They crafted sharp spearheads for hunting and scrapers for cleaning animal hides. Think of them as the first inventors, creating the technology they needed to survive in a wild and unpredictable landscape. Their entire existence was tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the movement of the animals they hunted. After the last ice age ended, around 10,000 years ago, Britain finally became the island we know today. The melting ice caused sea levels to rise, flooding the land bridge that connected it to Europe. The people who lived here were now cut off, and their culture began to develop in its own unique way. The forests grew thick and dense, filled with deer, wild boar and other animals. People learned to fish in the rivers and gather nuts and berries from the woods. This was the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age. It was a time of adaptation where people learned to thrive in a new, greener and wetter England, using their knowledge of nature to build a life for themselves. Then came another huge change: farming. Around 6,000 years ago, people learned how to grow crops like wheat and barley, and how to raise animals like sheep and cattle. This was the Neolithic revolution, and it changed everything. For the first time, people could stay in one place. They built permanent homes and villages. They cleared the forest to create fields, and with more time on their hands, they began to build incredible monuments. The most famous of these is Stonehenge. Imagine the effort it took. People worked together to drag huge stones over many miles and then raise them into the amazing circle we still see today. It was probably a temple, a calendar, or a burial ground. We don't know for sure, but it shows us that these early people had complex beliefs and a highly organized society. As the Stone Age gave way to the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, life in Britain continued to evolve. People learned how to work with metal, creating stronger tools, more effective weapons, and beautiful jewelry. Society was organized into different tribes, each with its own chief and its own territory. They lived in impressive hill forts, which were like fortified villages built on high ground for protection. Imagine strong wooden walls and deep ditches surrounding a community of roundhouses with thatched roofs. These people were the Britons. They were farmers, warriors, and skilled craftspeople. They had a rich culture, with priests called Druids, who were very important figures, acting as teachers, judges, and spiritual leaders. This was the world the Romans found when they arrived. In 55 BC, a famous Roman general named Julius Caesar crossed the sea from Gaul, which is now France. He came with his powerful army, his legions. His first two visits were not full-scale invasions, more like scouting missions. But about 100 years later, in the year 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius decided it was time to conquer Britain for good. The Roman army was the best in the world. It was highly organized with well-trained soldiers and superior weapons. The British tribes fought back bravely, but they couldn't stop the mighty Roman war machine. One by one, they were defeated, and Britain became a province of the vast Roman Empire. Roman rule lasted for nearly 400 years, and it transformed the country. The Romans were brilliant builders and organizers. They built a network of long, straight roads that connected the country like never before. Many of our modern roads still follow these ancient Roman routes. They built new towns and cities like Londinium, Iberacum, and Aquae Sulis. These towns had amazing things the Britons had never seen before, like public baths, temples, theatres, and forums, which were big open squares for markets and meetings. They also brought new laws, a new language, Latin, and new beliefs to the island, introducing a level of order and infrastructure that was completely new. But the Romans didn't control the whole island. They built a huge wall in the north called Hadrian's Wall to mark the edge of their empire and keep out the fierce tribes of what is now Scotland. Life in Roman Britain was a mix of old and new. Many Britons adopted Roman customs, wore Roman-style clothes called togas, and lived in comfortable houses called villas with beautiful mosaic floors and even central heating. But in the countryside, many people's lives didn't change that much. They still spoke their own language and followed their old traditions. Then, around the year 410 AD, the Roman Empire began to crumble. The legions were called back to defend Rome, and Britain was left to fend for itself once more. After the Romans left, England entered a period often called the Dark Ages. It wasn't really dark, just different. New groups of people started sailing across the North Sea from lands we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They were looking for new land to farm and new homes for their families. Over time, they settled across the country, pushing the native Britons west into areas like Wales and Cornwall. These newcomers, the Anglo-Saxons, established their own small kingdoms. England was not one country yet, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, each with its own king. Life in Anglo-Saxon England was centered around the village and the hall of the local lord. People were loyal to their king and their community. They were skilled woodworkers and metal workers, creating beautiful objects decorated with intricate patterns. They told epic stories of heroes and monsters like the famous poem Beowulf. At first they were pagans worshipping gods like Woden and Thor, but then missionaries arrived from Rome and Ireland bringing a new religion, Christianity. Slowly, the Anglo-Saxon kings converted and churches and monasteries were built across the land. These monasteries became important centers of learning, where monks copied out books by hand and preserved knowledge from the past. Just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were becoming more settled, a new threat appeared from the sea. Fierce warriors sailed from Scandinavia in their amazing longships. These were the Vikings. From the late 8th century. They began raiding the English coast. They attacked monasteries first because they were wealthy and poorly defended. The Vikings were terrifyingly effective fighters, and their raids spread fear throughout the land. But soon, they weren't just raiding anymore, they started to stay. A huge Viking force called the Great Heathen Army arrived and conquered large parts of northern and eastern England. This area became known as the Danelaw, where Viking laws and customs were followed. One Anglo-Saxon kingdom stood strong against the Vikings, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. Its king was a remarkable man named Alfred the Great. Alfred was a clever and determined leader. He fought the Vikings to a standstill and then made a peace treaty with them. He realized that to protect his kingdom he needed to be cleverer than his enemies. He built a network of fortified towns called boroughs and reorganized his army so it could react quickly to attacks. He also understood the importance of education and had important books translated from Latin into English so more people could read them. Alfred's efforts saved his kingdom and laid the foundations for the first United Kingdom of England. After Alfred the Great saved Wessex, his children and grandchildren continued his work. They didn't just want to defend their own kingdom, they wanted to win back the lands the Vikings had conquered. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, were brilliant military leaders. They led their armies north, fighting battle after battle to push back the borders of the Danelaw. They recaptured towns and built new fortifications, slowly extending their control over the whole of England. It was a long and difficult process, taking many years of patient and determined effort to bring the different regions under the rule of one family. The final piece of the puzzle was put in place by Alfred's grandson, Athelstan. He was a powerful and ambitious king who won a huge victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. This battle was enormous. Athelstan led an army of Anglo-Saxons against a combined force of Vikings, Scots, and Britons. His victory was so complete that it secured his position as the most powerful ruler in Britain. For the first time, all the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the areas of the Danelaw were brought together under one king. Athelstan was the first man who could truly call himself the king of all England. The idea of England as a single unified country had finally become a reality. With the country united, the Anglo-Saxon kings created a system of government that was very advanced for its time. The kingdom was divided into shires, which are like our modern counties. Each shire had a shire reeve, or sheriff, who was the king's representative responsible for collecting taxes and enforcing the law. This created a direct link between the king and the people in every part of the country. They also developed a sophisticated system for making money, with royal mints producing coins that were used everywhere. This helped trade to flourish and made the kingdom wealthy and stable. The late Anglo-Saxon state was well organized and powerful. However, the story wasn't over. In 1066, the English king, Edward the Confessor, died without leaving a child to inherit the throne. This created a crisis. 3 different men claimed they should be the next king. One was an English nobleman named Harold Godwinson, another was the King of Norway, Harold Hardrada, and the third was William, the powerful Duke of Normandy in France. Harold Godwinson was chosen as king by the English nobles, but he had to fight for his crown. He defeated the Norwegian invasion in the north, only to hear that William of Normandy had landed with his army in the south. Harold rushed his tired army down the country to face this new threat, leading to one of the most famous dates in English history. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 changed England forever. Harold's Anglo-Saxon army fought bravely all day, forming a strong shield wall on top of a hill. But in the end, the Norman cavalry and archers proved too strong. King Harold was killed, famously it is said, by an arrow to the eye. William, Duke of Normandy, had won. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. He became known as William the Conqueror, but his victory was just the beginning. The English people did not accept him easily, and he spent the next few years brutally putting down rebellions across the country. He was a harsh and effective ruler. William the Conqueror completely changed the way England was run. He took all the land from the Anglo-Saxon nobles and gave it to his own loyal Norman barons, knights and bishops. In return for the land, they had to promise to fight for him. This was called the feudal system. It created a new French-speaking ruling class that sat on top of the English-speaking population. To make sure he knew exactly how much his new kingdom was worth, William sent officials all over the country to record who owned what and how many people and animals lived there. The results were collected in the famous Domesday Book, a giant survey that gives us an amazing snapshot of life in England at the time. Over the next century, the Norman kings became more and more powerful, but sometimes a king could be too powerful or just plain bad. This was the case with King John, who ruled in the early 13th century. John was greedy, cruel, and unsuccessful in his wars. He demanded huge amounts of tax money from his barons to pay for his failures, and he ignored their traditional rights. The barons finally had enough. In 1215, they rebelled and forced King John to meet them at a place called Runnymede. There they made him agree to a list of demands written down in a document called Magna Carta, which means Great Charter. This was a revolutionary moment in the history of freedom. Magna Carta was so important because for the first time it established the principle that nobody, not even the king, was above the law. It said that the king could not just take money or punish people without a good reason and a fair trial. Although it was originally meant to protect the barons, its ideas grew over time to protect everyone. This led to another big step, the creation of Parliament. Kings started calling meetings of knights and town representatives to ask for their agreement to new taxes. This slowly evolved into the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the foundation of the government we still have today. The idea that rulers should listen to their people began to take root. After years of struggle for power, including a bitter civil war called the Wars of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York, a new family came to the throne, the Tudors. The first Tudor king, Henry VII, won the crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. He was clever and careful, and he brought peace and stability back to England after years of fighting. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who would become one of England's most famous and, well, infamous kings. Henry VIII is best known for having 6 wives, but his desperate search for a male heir had enormous consequences for the entire country. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII made a radical decision. He broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, which had been the official religion in England for 1,000 years. He declared himself the supreme head of a new Church of England. This was the English Reformation. Henry closed down all the rich and powerful monasteries, taking their land and wealth for himself. This act changed not only the religion of the country, but also the landscape, leaving hundreds of monasteries as romantic ruins. It also made the king incredibly rich and powerful, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the nation. Henry's children all ruled after him. Edward VI was a devout Protestant, Mary I was a fierce Catholic who tried to reverse the changes, and finally Elizabeth I, who became one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth's long reign is often called a golden age. She was intelligent and politically skilled, and she found a middle way in religion that most of her people could accept. It was a time of great confidence and creativity, the age of William Shakespeare writing his amazing plays. English sailors like Sir Francis Drake explored the world, traded in new goods, and challenged the power of Spain, the superpower of the day. In 1588, England famously defeated the Spanish Armada, a huge fleet sent to invade the country. When Elizabeth I died in 1603 without any children, the Tudor dynasty ended. The throne passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This began the Stuart period. For the first time, England and Scotland had the same king. The Stuarts, however, believed strongly in the divine right of kings, the idea that God had chosen them to rule and that they shouldn't be questioned by Parliament. This belief set them on a collision course with a Parliament that had grown used to having its voice heard. This clash between the king and Parliament would dominate the 17th century and lead the country into a period of violence and revolution. The conflict between the Stuart kings and Parliament came to a head under James I's son, King Charles I. Charles believed, even more strongly than his father, that he should be able to rule without interference. He needed money, but Parliament refused to grant him taxes unless he listened to their complaints about his policies and his religious changes, which many people thought were too close to Catholicism. Frustrated, Charles I decided to rule without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. He raised money through old and unpopular methods, which made him even more disliked. The tension between the two sides grew and grew until it could no longer be contained. In 1642, the arguments finally exploded into a full-blown civil war. The country was torn apart. Families were divided and neighbours fought against neighbours. On one side were the royalists, or cavaliers, who supported the king. They were generally from the nobility and the rural north and west. On the other side were the parliamentarians, or roundheads, who were supported by London, the southeast and the navy. The parliamentarians created a new, highly effective army, the New Model Army, led by a brilliant general named Oliver Cromwell. After years of brutal fighting, the parliamentarians won. What happened next was shocking to the whole of Europe. The victorious Parliament put King Charles I on trial for treason against his own people. They found him guilty, and in January 1649 he was executed in London. The monarchy was abolished, and for a short time England became a republic called the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell eventually became its leader with the title Lord Protector. He was a strict Puritan and a strong ruler, but his government was unpopular with many. After Cromwell died, people grew tired of military rule and the strict Puritan laws. They wanted to bring back the stability and tradition of the monarchy. In 1660, the executed king's son, who had been living in exile, was invited back to England. He was crowned King Charles II, and this event is known as the Restoration. The monarchy was back, but things were different. The king could no longer rule without the consent of Parliament. The balance of power had shifted for good. This was confirmed a few decades later, in 1688, during the Glorious Revolution. When King James II, a Catholic, tried to ignore Parliament, he was forced to flee. Parliament invited his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to take the throne instead. They had to agree to the Bill of Rights, a law that permanently limited the king's power and protected the rights of Parliament. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Bill of Rights created a stable system of government in England. The power was now shared between the monarch and Parliament, which gave the country the confidence to grow and prosper. One of the most significant events of this new era happened in 1707. The Parliaments of England and Scotland passed the Acts of Union. This historic agreement joined the two kingdoms together to create a brand new country. the Kingdom of Great Britain. While Scotland kept its own legal and religious systems, it now shared a monarch and a parliament with England based in London. This union created a larger, more powerful state on the world stage. This new, stable Great Britain was perfectly placed for another revolution, but this one wasn't about kings or battles, it was about machines. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid-18th century, and it would change the world more than any king or queen ever had. It started with new inventions in the textile industry, like the spinning jenny and the power loom, which could make cloth much faster than people could by hand. To power these new machines, inventors like James Watt perfected the steam engine. Steam power, fueled by Britain's plentiful supplies of coal, could be used to run factories, pump water out of mines, and eventually power trains and ships. The Industrial Revolution completely transformed the country. Huge factories and mills were built, and new cities sprang up around them, especially in the north and Midlands of England. Places like Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham grew from small towns into massive industrial centres. Millions of people left the countryside where their families had farmed for generations to find work in the new factories. For the first time in history, more people lived in towns and cities than in rural areas. Life for these new workers was incredibly hard. They worked very long hours in dangerous conditions for very low pay, and they lived in crowded and unsanitary houses. This new industrial power made Britain incredibly wealthy. It became known as the workshop of the world, producing goods like iron, coal and textiles that were sold all over the globe. A network of canals and then railways was built to transport raw materials to the factories and finished goods to the ports. This economic strength, combined with the power of the Royal Navy, helped Britain to build a vast overseas empire. By the 19th century, during the long reign of Queen Victoria, the British Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, covering about a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Britain was the most powerful and influential nation on the planet. The 19th century was the peak of Britain's power, but the 20th century brought immense challenges that would reshape England's place in the world. The century began with the nation at the heart of a global empire, but two devastating world wars changed everything. The First World War from 1914 to 1918 and the Second World War from 1939 to 1945 cost Britain dearly, both in human lives and in economic strength. The country fought and won, but it was left exhausted and deeply in debt. The wars showed that Britain was no longer the world's sole superpower. New powers like the United States and the Soviet Union had risen to prominence. After the Second World War, the world entered a new era. The great European empires began to dissolve. Across Asia, Africa and the Caribbean, people in British colonies demanded and won their independence. Over the course of a few decades, the vast British Empire was transformed into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations with shared history and values. This was a huge change for England. It had to find a new identity and a new role in a world it no longer dominated. It was a difficult adjustment, a journey from being the ruler of a global empire to being a partner on the European and world stage. At home, England also went through enormous social changes. After the war, the government created the National Health Service, promising free healthcare for everyone. It also expanded education and built new houses to create a fairer society. In the decades that followed, people from former colonies in the Commonwealth were invited to come to Britain to help rebuild the country. This wave of immigration made England a much more diverse and multicultural society. The arrival of people from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan and many other places brought new foods, new music and new traditions that have enriched English culture in countless ways. Today, as we look back on this long and incredible journey, we can see the echoes of the past all around us. The language we speak is a mix of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French. The laws and government that shape our lives have roots in Magna Carta and the struggles between kings and parliament. The cities we live in were often shaped by the Romans or the Industrial Revolution. England is now a modern, diverse nation, part of an interconnected global community. Its story, from the first hunter-gatherers to the present day, is a tale of constant change, of invasion and settlement, of conflict and creativity, and of how a small island on the edge of Europe came to